Hello, everyone. My name is Joelle Simone Anthony, and today I am joined by Lauren Leroy.
Hi, I'm Lauren, also known as Little Miss Funeral.
And today we are actually going to be talking about something that's really not talked about, an aspect of the funeral service industry that involves racism. Now, just to be clear and set the tone for our conversation, I want to read the definition of what racism is. Racism is defined as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. So, Lauren, I know we have two completely different experiences because you're in the north, up in Buffalo, and I am in the deep south here in Atlanta, Georgia. And I want to preface this by saying that though racism is an issue that I have experienced in the funeral home, it has been in such small comparison to the positive things that I've experienced in the funeral service industry, particularly in the funeral home. What about you, Lauren?
So we kind of just stopped and we cut and edited this a little bit because I had said something that was not what I had meant to say, and Joelle actually was educating me on that. And I had said that my experience is going to be completely different from Joelle just because I am white, and I had used the word privilege. And Joelle was kind of like, Lauren, I don't think that's what you meant. And Joelle, can you kind of go off of what you were just telling me then before? Because
Definitely.
I think it's super important to have this in this video just to educate. I mean, you're educating me right now. So just to kind of get this language and get all of this out there for people.
Definitely. Like you said, you use the word privilege, and I think that's the problem, that being white or being a person that is not of color, particularly African American, is somehow a privilege. That is not what I know for a fact. That is not what you meant when you said it. But there are people that feel that because they're born white or a fair skin or not considered to be a person of color, or because they're racially ambiguous, which means that they look like they can fall into a category other than being black, that they're somehow superior. And that's not okay. But it's almost, I don't want to say it's not their fault. Like you're saying, you're being educated, right? In today's racial environment, if you choose to remain ignorant, you're making a choice not to necessarily be a racist, but to not consider that your perception could be wrong, you know?
Absolutely.
And I really appreciate the fact that you want to learn, Lauren, that you're open. Like I said, I don't feel as if you meant any harm or malice in what you said, but to someone else hearing that, it would be like, oh my God, this little white girl thinks she's better than me because she's white, you know?
Absolutely.
I don't want to say the average black woman, but to a black woman or black person of color, it may come across that way. I want to make it clear that my intention in having this conversation is to help us as funeral directors and in any other industry become better at what we do as individuals. And like we said in our last discussion, everything starts with us, but everything that we do in the funeral service industry is for the family.
Absolutely.
And I have had African American families, when I was working in predominantly white funeral homes, ask me or feel comfortable enough to confide in me and say, is my family member okay here? Are they going to be treated with respect and dignity? Because, you know, most of the funeral directors or people or faces or things that I see here represent a culture that isn't my own. And I just want to make sure that my family member is going to be okay. And it's almost a heartbreaking question to have to answer, because the average person working in a funeral home is pouring their heart into what they do, regardless of what color or culture the person is that they're serving. But like with anything else in life, we would be ignorant to believe that there aren't people in the funeral service industry who either, like yourself, may not know or be aware of the power of our words, the way that we say something, the things that we do, or how something is perceived from someone of another culture or ethnic background. So I think it's really important, and I appreciate you so much for even being open to having this conversation. I think this is going to be powerful and not only help us as individuals, because there are things that I don't understand about non-African American culture,
Yeah.
that I'll never be able to experience because I'm an African American woman.
Yeah.
But I'm going to learn a lot from you as well. So, and I don't want anyone to feel guilty because they don't know,
Absolutely.
and I think I've talked to non-African American, particularly white funeral directors, some Hispanic, that have a level of guilt because they don't necessarily know how to relate to African American families. So have you actually had any experience dealing with racism in the funeral home?
So I have never had any sort of racism directed towards me. I have done, and honestly, I've been licensed as a funeral director for 8 years, and I can count the number of African American families that I've served on one hand. And I think that the reason behind that, and I'm interested to hear how it is, down where you are as well, but up here, like in at least my community, we have funeral homes for different people. And right now, I work for a Polish funeral home. So 90% of the families that come into the funeral home have Polish heritage. Before I worked for the Polish funeral home, and I am Polish, I come from Polish heritage. So I fit in there. I get the customs, I get the tradition, I understand that because that's how I grew up. Now, before I worked for this Polish funeral home, I actually worked for an Italian funeral home. And believe it or not, my maiden name's Polanski. Believe it or not, I got like a little bit of pushback sometimes from the Italian families that I would serve because I wasn't Italian. But it was more of like a joking matter than I ever felt like it was anything like negative towards me. It was kind of like, oh, this little Polish girl is helping us out and stuff like that. But that's really as far as it goes for that. So up here where I am, like I was saying, you have your funeral home. So I work for a Polish funeral home. We have the Italian funeral homes. You have your German funeral homes, and you have your African American funeral homes. And how I feel like it is up here is that people, when you die, customs and tradition are very important. I mean, even if you never have gone to church, it seems that like while you are living, it seems that when people die, they go back to those traditions. So mom may have never gone to church, but she grew up in a Catholic family. So when she dies, we want to have a Catholic mass, even if we don't know what that entails. And I feel that the families within our communities choose the funeral homes that they think are going to be able to best understand those customs and those traditions. Not that they wouldn't necessarily, not that the funeral professionals wouldn't be open and accepting to invite these different cultures in, but it's just, we're going to go to Smith Funeral Home because they already know what's going on. We've used them in the past for every other funeral that we've done. So that's how it kind of seems things just go over here. That's why I feel like in my career I've done only a handful of African American funerals because I was working for the Italian guy and now I'm working for the Polish guy.
As far as how things go down here, definitely. I'm from a small town in South Carolina. I moved here 14 years ago to go to college and then mortuary school, and I've been here ever since. But back home, there definitely is segregation as far as the Black people go to a particular one of two particular funeral homes in my town, and the white people, the majority of the white people go to the white firm that's in my small town.
Do you think that people are, I don't want to say like afraid to go to a different funeral home, but I really think it's a comfort level. I don't think that like, and what I mean by that is it seems that I've been at the funeral home where I am now for 5 years.
Okay.
And I have served so many of the same families over and over again where I know these people. it's kind of like one of those things, the people who keep coming back to our funeral home, do they have Polish heritage? Yes. But I feel that they keep coming back because we just are the funeral home that their family has always used. And they're pleased with the service. They get to know our staff, so they don't look someplace else. I feel that the initial thing that called them to our funeral home was the name of the funeral home, because it's a Polish name. So when they're looking in the phone book, you know, I think it's that comfort level where these people are like me, might be what they're thinking in their mind, so I'm going to call them. So do you think, I mean, I really think that that's a huge thing for somebody who may not know, for somebody who may not have experience with losing somebody when they're calling a funeral home for the first time. I think sometimes name recognition, you know, if you're of a certain heritage like that, can call you in. Do you think, I'm just rambling on here, but do you think like it's the same? Do you agree with me, or?
I agree, definitely, especially when I think about what goes on in South Carolina, back home in my hometown. Definitely. Name recognition, your family goes there, your church uses that funeral home. Here in Atlanta, being that so many people aren't necessarily from here, I think a lot of it has to do with proximity.
Yeah.
You know, the phone may ring and someone's trying to find out the price of what things cost, because of course Atlanta is oversaturated with funeral homes. And the price a lot of times is a determining factor. Or the cost, I'll say the cost is a determining factor. And also what people value. And also here, to be honest, I think status plays a large part of it, because there are funeral homes here. I'm not going to call any names because I'm not associated with that company anymore.
Yeah.
But there is a funeral home here that is more sought after because they've had more high profile cases, such as politicians, civil rights activists, celebrities, things of that nature. So I think there are a lot more determining factors here, like I said, because people aren't necessarily from here. I think in a smaller community, you have your roots, and that's how funeral homes stay in business for hundreds of years. But in a big city like Atlanta, well, Atlanta isn't a big city, but in a city like Atlanta, I think there are multiple things in play. But I definitely know for a fact that if a African-American person dies, they're probably going to call a funeral home that they've either seen on TV or advertised with someone who looks like them, either on a billboard or a commercial or sounds like them. There's a funeral home here that I think did something extremely genius. They actually did their radio promotion in Spanish, and it's a Black-owned funeral home. And I just think that was genius. I've had experience with racism in several different forms in the funeral service industry and in the funeral home. And I say that as if they're two different things, because there truly are. When you're dealing with the funeral service industry, you're dealing with vendors, you're dealing with a lot of people who offer services and merchandise behind the scenes that aren't necessarily tied directly to the funeral home. When you're dealing with the funeral home, you're dealing with the funeral directors, you're dealing with, you know, office managers, you know, people that are actually in the funeral home. And another aspect is also the medical examiner's office. Most of my experience falls into one or two categories, which is either an assumption made about someone because of their skin color, or either a mental or actual segregation. And I think it would be unfair to say that racism in the funeral service industry or funeral home only comes from white people, because it doesn't. There are conversations held behind doors where comments may be made by African-American funeral directors that are negative as they pertain to white people. And I'm sure it happens vice versa. I remember working a funeral, or working with a family once, and I overheard a funeral director say to someone else, well, do you think they're going to be on time? And I felt as if that was extremely racist. Number one, because I'd never heard you say that about working with a white family, but because it's a Black family and there's this belief that Black people are never on time, you make a smart comment like that. And whether it was a joke or not, it's still racist, because it's an assumption made about someone because they're a different color than you.
Absolutely.
Here in the South, in particularly, dealing with older white men in the funeral service industry and funeral home sometimes can be I've had some experiences.
I can't
So,
even imagine. I know I'm good friends with Melissa, who's the modern mortician, and she's in
mhm,
Texas.
mhm.
And I feel like it's just, once again, I'm up north, so it's hard for me to say, but from listening to her talk as well, she kind of describes it as the good old boys club,
Definitely.
and it's kind of that mentality and that mindset that I feel that older generation has.
Like my thing is alternative funeral and burial. And a lot of times when talking to African American people and presenting options other than your standard, embalming, burial, funeral, wake, and all the big flowers and the family cars and everything, if I try to talk to an African American family, at times I've received resistance when talking about options such as space burial or burial at sea or things like that. The comment that I get is, oh, that's for white folks, or that's for rich white folks. And it blows my mind that in 2018, there are African American people or people of color that would self-segregate themselves from an option just based on, I don't know if it's programming, and I don't want to make it seem like there's not a legitimate reason why people have these thoughts, but I just think it's important that we're open-minded to options that we're not familiar with.
Absolutely. It all comes back to educating yourself.
Mhm.
It comes back to knowing that every single person out there has these options available to them. By hearing a family make a comment like that, it makes you think, well, why are you saying that? Where does that come from? And how do we fix that?
We're there to comfort them. We're there to help them and guide them through the process as best we can and basically do our jobs. What is the line? Like, where's the line where you say, okay, well, why do you feel that way to someone who's grieving, and try to
Absolutely.
educate them or change their perspective on an issue that boils down to racism or segregated thinking?
I feel like for us, the time and place to do that education is not when they're sitting in front of us, not when they have
Okay.
just lost a loved one.
But I wanted to get back to our conversation about the experiences that we've had. Um, I'll share one of the stories that I have shared in the blog, which will be somewhere
In the
around
link
here.
below.
Yeah, in the link below. But I was working with a family whose son had died in a boating accident when I was working with a majority Caucasian funeral home. And one of the directors were basically giving the family their options, and they couldn't find anything that they felt represented their son. It was a Black gentleman who passed away. Both of his parents were also Black. And the white funeral director called me into his office and jokingly said, they don't have money. They don't usually have money for this, but because it's not a shooting, they might. And
Oh,
I was blown away, just blown away that this man said this. And I talked to our manager about it, and his claim was that it was said in a joking manner.
that's
And to
always the
me,
excuse, and that's not an excuse.
it's not an excuse at all. And to be honest, the family was very well off. We didn't know this at the time. We learned this, after the funeral's over, as you do in most cases. But it shouldn't matter either way.
No.
And that goes back to presenting options. I've felt in certain situations, especially with working in predominantly white funeral homes, that certain options weren't presented to African American families because there was an assumption that they didn't have the money for it, or, for whatever reason, they weren't worthy of it. And like I said, my experience with racism has been minute in comparison to the positive things that have happened in the funeral service industry and in the funeral home. But it would be unfair not to talk about it if we're having this conversation. So I think it's important that if you're a white or Black or any color funeral director, when you're having a conversation with a family, don't make an assumption on their financial ability or their financial status based on the color of their skin. That's ridiculous, and it's extremely racist. It
Absolutely.
is. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's kind of funny that you say that, because I have known funeral directors who do that for, and once again, you know, the families that I do serve are white, but I have known of funeral directors who make assumptions like that based on how people walk into the funeral home, whether or not the color of their skin, based on how they're dressed and the kind of cars that they're driving. So I know that my example that I was just going off of doesn't really go with race, but it still was under the same concept of just judging people,
Yes.
how they look when they walk in.
Another issue that I've had as it pertains to race is my name. My name is Joelle, but if you write my name down on a piece of paper, it could read Joel, it could read Jolie to some people. And I've had specific cases, I had a medical examining tech assume that I was going to be a white man when coming to retrieve a body from the medical examiner's office because the funeral home was predominantly white. And I mean, this guy was so nasty to me. Like, I'm a random person off the street. I have access to this funeral home's van, their keys. I'm using their equipment, and I'm coming to get a random dead body from your establishment. And he made that assumption because I showed up as a Black woman. And he would not release the body to me until I called and had one of the representatives from the funeral home say on speakerphone, yeah, like, she's coming to get the body. What's the problem? And that falls into that assumption again. Like, don't assume that someone's capability, don't make assumptions about someone's capability because of the color of their skin.
Absolutely.
I think that's a huge problem. We're talking about like racism and everything in the funeral home. And there's a big difference. And I mentioned this in the blog. I started off by saying I've worked in both private and public. And what I mean by private and public, as we know, we have like your big corporation, that's private. And then you have your mom and pops, which are considered public, right? So in the private sector, you have an HR department. So if someone says something or you feel as if there's a problem, you turn it over to the manager. And if you still don't feel like there's any resolve, you go to HR directly. And there's supposed to be a plan of action for either dealing with it or getting rid of the problem, right? Well, in public funeral homes, like your mom and pops, you just have your funeral directors, and other than your state board, there's really no one to say, okay, this was right or this was wrong, if the owner of the funeral home or the managing funeral director doesn't address the issue head on. So what has been your experience with that?
And those have only been my experiences. I've only worked for mom and pop shops. And honestly, most of my experiences working in a mom and pop shop have been pretty positive. Just speaking of like HR and things like that, I just let slip under the rug from just being a female comments that are made because there's nobody you're almost in a position where, do I say something and potentially maybe lose a job? Or
make enemies?
Exactly. Or this is such a competitive industry and word travels quickly. Or do I just kind of brush it off to the side and let it all go? And in most of the instances that I've had very good instances being experiences being a female in a funeral home, but I have had comments and things made just because I'm a woman. But let's stick to the whole topic of this conversation, which is racism within a funeral industry. And I do know of funeral directors within my area. This is a very traditional field, and you take it with a grain of salt. I actually heard a male Caucasian funeral director talking about how he had an African American family call him and he turned them down. And I think it was maybe 2 years ago that I heard him say this. And I think his words were, well, they sounded Black on the phone, so I told them to call this person. Wow. And I swear my mouth kind of like opened up and I kind of just looked over at him and I was like, are you serious? And the people that he was talking to, because he wasn't talking to me, the people he was talking to did not say anything to him. Like, they didn't say, granted, he was surrounded by white males, right. But were they agreeing with him? by staying silent? Were they thinking in their mind, this guy is just such a jerk, it's not even worth my breath to say something? You know, you don't know what was going through their minds, but I could not believe what I had heard. And for me, I'm thinking, you're a funeral director. Like, it is your job to serve the community. It doesn't matter the color of a person's skin. It doesn't matter their religious backgrounds, their sexual orientation. When a family comes to you, you are entrusted with their loved one. You're entrusted with somebody who is the most important person in their lives. And how can you sleep at night turning somebody away because they sounded black on the phone? Like, it blows my mind. And it's something that happens, you know, in today's day and age. This wasn't a comment that was made 40 years ago.
And the thing is, Lauren, it's so hard not to get angry when you hear things like that. And when you, like that, like, how do you sound black on the phone? Like, what did he say? Like, and even if he would have been like, what up, yo, my mom's just died. Like, he could have been a white person saying that, you know, like how, and I think that's a part of the problem. Like, we have these lanes or boxes in our mind for certain people. And when I say we, I think to an extent, I don't want to say we're all racist, but we all make assumptions about people. And I guess what I'm trying to do is what can we contribute to this conversation that kind of helps people break those barriers and get certain groups of people, because of their ethnicity or culture or skin color, out of those boxes, and to improve the funeral service industry in the world as a whole? Like, what do you think we can do to encourage that?
And I think a huge thing is, and this can be very difficult to do, just because, like I said, the day and age that we're living in, you know, there's just so much out there. I think that it's important when certain comments are made or when certain words are said. I know you kind of said this at the beginning, when I said the word privilege before. You didn't get mad at me, or at least you didn't seem to get mad at me. Instead, what you did was you educated me on what I had said. And I feel that as humans, it's our first instinct to get angry and to almost fight back. And I think that that goes for anything, not necessarily even, you know, just for race. I just think that when it comes to our personal lives and our personal beliefs, if something is said in today's day and age, we just want to kind of fight back a little bit and be like, well, hold up, just wait, you know, and I feel like this is the difficult part. Instead of getting angry, or instead of saying like, oh, this person is just ignorant, because let's say there's a lot of ignorance in the world. But if people are willing to learn, and if people are willing to grow and open themselves up as people, we need to be there, and we need to be willing to help them with that. Right. And I think just talking about things, you know, I don't know how active you are on Twitter or not. I'm not very active on Twitter. I go on like to tweet some of my videos, but that's basically it. But I follow some huge activists on there for all different things, disability, and, you know, all different kinds of things like that. And there are some people on there who are so good at putting out positive information for educating people. But when you're online, sometimes you can't always perceive a tone, you know, and if people are writing something, you're going to read it a certain way, whether or not maybe they meant it that way.
Exactly.
So I feel that, like, you know, that's a huge thing. Did somebody mean something in a racist way? Did they say something that's without thinking about it? Are they just unaware of what they said? I feel like it's our jobs to try our very best to just not get angry and just to, you know, help people grow.
I think from my standpoint, as a Black woman talking to a white woman or a white funeral director, I think it's important to understand from an African American standpoint, or be open to understanding that there's a legitimate reason. We talked a little bit about the fear that I said some of the Black families have expressed to me when bringing their loved one to a white funeral home. There's a reason that they feel that way.
Absolutely.
It's not paranoia. It's not it shouldn't be written off. And I think it's important, whether you're a white person working with a black person working with a Hispanic person, or any combination of the two, just to try to understand from a racial standpoint what the tone of our environment is and what that family may be thinking that they aren't saying. Because like I said about Atlanta, one of the major factors here is proximity. If you live outside of the city's limits, you may not have access to a predominantly black funeral home. So you may just use the funeral home in your neighborhood that is white. But maybe there are thoughts you don't feel safe expressing to a white person or a person that doesn't share your culture. And I think it's just important to create a safe space, regardless of who we're serving, but especially when you're dealing with someone that's different from you or looks different from you. And I hate that. I don't want to say that I don't see color, because I do. I see how people of different backgrounds are treated because of their color. I see how Black people have been treated because of my color. And I think I don't want to say I hate it when people say I don't see color, but I just hate that we have to have this conversation, but I love that we're having this conversation.
I know.
And I just can't express how much I appreciate you for it.
It's almost, and you're amazing too, Joelle, even with you are so amazing with just how you portray yourself, with how you speak. You are just a great educator with yourself and with your knowledge and with your background. And we have had completely different experiences. And I do fully believe that the experiences that we have had are based on our skin tone. I think that also we've probably had a lot of similar situations with how we've been treated professionally in this field, because we're also women. Yes. And that's a huge conversation for another day as well. But, it's true. We're treated differently in this profession because we're women. I've been treated differently because of families, because I'm a woman. So if I'm treated differently because of my sex, I'm also being treated differently because of my skin tone. And you have to acknowledge that. And when you acknowledge that is when we can really grow and change as people.
Yeah. So I guess in closing, I want to invite you to take a pledge that I kind of came up with. I haven't figured out the exact wording, but basically, as a funeral director and as a professional, I am pledging and making a commitment to treat everyone with love and respect. If your family member should happen to come into my care, I promise you that I will not allow myself to discriminate because of race, religion, sexuality, any devising factor. I will do the best that I can do to help your family, to help you, and to take care of your loved one. And I'd like to invite you to pledge to that as well.
Absolutely, I can pledge to that. I feel that's the core of what we do as funeral professionals, to love everybody, to care for everybody, and to do our best that we can make people's lives differently. 100% I pledge to that.
About any other funeral professional that wants to make that statement publicly, please do.
Absolutely. If you want to put in the comments below that you make this pledge with us, just so we can be there to support you, to know that, we're allies, and just to kind of create a community where we can lean on each other as well. We should almost be creating a safe space to ask people questions,
Yes.
That it's great where, if you are an African-American person and if you have questions about, Caucasians, I would be more than happy to answer any questions in the comments below or by email. If a funeral director out there would have a Caucasian family and have a question about cosmetics or just something, I would be more than happy to just give whatever knowledge I have on that. And Joelle, I don't know if you would feel the same way too, just being
Definitely.
An ally for people.
Definitely. And I know some people aren't into being public. So, I'm available through email, through direct message, and whatever you share with me, as long as you're not harming a family or someone that's been entrusted into your care, whatever you say will remain confidential, and I'll answer your questions confidentially as well. And if you guys have, would like more videos like this, just let us know, because I think this conversation is so important. And like you said, I mean, we can go into sexism, we can go into homophobia, we can go into so many different areas with this. So I'm excited to keep having these conversations, Lauren.
Absolutely. I think you need to have the difficult conversations. We have to talk about these things because this is real life.
Yes, it is. So Lauren, tell everybody where they can find you.
I am basically Little Miss Funeral everywhere: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. My website, littlemissfuneral.com, and then my YouTube channel /Little Miss Funeral. And I'm also littlemissfuneral@gmail.com for anybody who, like Joelle was saying, has questions and maybe doesn't want to put them in the comments below.
Okay. I am the Grave Woman everywhere: social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, now on YouTube because I have 100 subscribers now. Yay! Trying to get to 100 million.
You will.
Thank you. Yay. You will too. We're going to do this together.
Awesome.
And I am thegravewoman@gmail.com. And thank you guys so much for watching. Live life, love hard, and we'll talk to you next time.